All right, welcome back. We are with the academic director, the Royal Institute of Philosophy in the UK, Julian Baggini. He's a writer, prolific author. One book we're going to talk about today is Atheism, a very short introduction. I think a lot of you guys know this series. Richard Bauckham and other Christian writers are in the series as well, but Julian has written a fantastic one here. The second edition is coming out soon. And How the World Thinks, another book of his. He's got another one out on the meaning of life. And we'll probably touch on a couple different topics today. So Julian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Stuart and Cliff.
Absolutely. Julian, maybe give us just a little bit on when it comes to atheism. We've, in our debates, discussions, whether it's kind of with some of the new atheists or students or philosophers on college campuses, we kind of get different understandings. Some would say kind of the new atheist approach, which perhaps is religion is bad. A lot of that's based out of what happened at 9/11. So fundamentalist religion is bad. So whether that's Islam or Christianity, you think of white supremacists, oftentimes connected, evangelicals connected to the fundamentalist Christianity, that perhaps is bad. Other definitions we've heard is scientism, progressive scientism as well, other forms, more so Nietzschean forms of atheism. So how do you define atheism, and what's kind of maybe a brief history of it?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one. It's no doubt that it's a very broad term. I mean, that it covers essentially anyone who doesn't believe in God. And for that reason, a lot of people think it's a purely negative term, which has no positive content. Now, I mean, that's kind of true if you take it semantically literally. But as we know, a lot of movements get their names in idiosyncratic ways, and they stick, right? So Quakers, Methodists, these started out as kind of nicknames. And I think you'd be sort of wrong to kind of think that you get to the essence of Methodism or the Quaker movement by focusing exactly on the name. Atheists are known as atheists because that's the word we use in a culture, a whole load of cultures in the Western world, which have been predominantly theist. So they're defined against what has been the dominant group. But I think essentially all an atheist is really saying is that they believe that the natural world is all that there is. There isn't a kind of a second hidden realm, a higher realm, an invisible realm, a spiritual realm, whatever it might be. So that's why I think that, in effect, although the term atheism just simply means you don't believe in God, and in positive terms, it's a belief that the universe, the world, is essentially the same. What the world we study through science, it's the natural world. It certainly gives rise to all sorts of things that don't necessarily have scientific definitions, like love and art and so forth. But at roots, that's what all there is. And of course, one of the major consequences of that is it makes us animals like any others with different capacities to others. So there are things that are special about us, but we're not special because we belong to a different category of being, ensouled beings. We are biological animals, and that means fully accepting our mortality. And I think that's the broad thing. Now, within that, you've got a lot of those different groups that you're talking about, and maybe we can talk about some of them as we go.
That's helpful. That's great. I heard you use the word belief there. It's fascinating because a lot of atheists I talk to will steer clear of belief, definitely faith, but you said believe in naturalism versus belief in God. How do you think through that one?
I don't have any problem with the word belief. I think that sometimes the people who think that belief implies something close to faith, which they want to distance themselves from, I think that's just mistaken. So, for example, if you take in philosophy, people have been trying to define knowledge for many centuries. One of the most common and popular definitions goes all the way back to Plato. It's knowledge is justified true belief. And all the belief thing is saying there that you hold something to be the case, you hold something to be true. Right. So to say that you believe something is uncontroversial. We believe things about what the capital of France is, how many grams a chocolate bar weighs. These are all things we believe. That doesn't mean that all forms of belief are are the same, and that therefore if you say it's a belief, then you're saying it's just like a belief in religion, because there are different kinds of belief. So I don't have any problem with that word. I think it's a bit odd, because what other word, interesting, what other word do they prefer to use then?
Always reason. I always hear reason or rationale. And
Well,
so
yeah,
you take like a Mark Twain quote and say, really where reason leaves off, faith kind of begins.
yeah,
and so it's a really pejorative term in many ways.
Well, that's strange, because I mean, reason is. I can understand that they want to say that reason and rationality is the method which leads them to hold the beliefs that they hold, but it's a different kind of word. Reason and rationality is a different kind of word to belief. I mean, you've got to hold. We all of us have things that we take to be true. What can we say? And I can't think of a clearer word than belief. If you're talking about reason, rationality, and faith, you're talking about the basis of belief, what the basis of your belief is. So the difference between an atheist and most religious believers, I think, is not that religious believers have belief and atheists have something else. It's that the atheist says that their beliefs are grounded in evidence and reason alone. And typically, but not always, religious believers think that faith is also a legitimate grounds for belief. And so they also have beliefs which are grounded in faith.
And that's helpful, because I would slightly parse that in the sense of, I think whether it's atheists, theists, or agnostics, so much of a worldview is shaped by the intellectual, the existential, emotional, the social. I think Sociology of Knowledge by Peter Berger, that's been a pretty profound, that's had an impact on me, at least. I got to speak, hear him speak a few times at BU. And we are so influenced, I think, especially on college campuses. I see so many professors influencing students, probably to go more so agnostic, atheist. And so much of it's just, that it's science versus religion. It's reason versus belief and faith. But I think it's a much more holistic thing. I don't think Christianity is just based on faith and emotion. I think there's a lot of rationale and intellectual, hopefully, study of it and thinking through the issues.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. I think it's a tremendous mistake when atheists try to make these distinctions too transparent and try to make it out that religious people simply don't have any rationality, don't use their rationality. As you say, it is very, very interconnected. So I think typically what happens with faith is that faith has a role in the belief formation, which it doesn't have for atheists. And atheists would give you arguments as to why it shouldn't have a role. So it's not just that we pick and choose. There are arguments there, but it does have a role. I mean, one of the books you mentioned earlier was How the World Thinks, and that's about global philosophy around the world. And one of the biggest differences you get in traditions is what these traditions take to be legitimate grounds of knowledge. And there's disagreement about that. So, for example, in most of the classical traditions of thought in India, there is an important place on what we could call insight. So there's a belief that often actually through practices of the body and through practices of concentration and so forth, a gifted person who is also works hard at this can gain a kind of insight into reality, into ultimate reality, which an ordinary person can't. And their perception and their testimony of their perception is considered to be a legitimate grounds of knowledge. That's very, very alien if you come from the tradition of Western philosophy. But the point is this, it's not that they simply believe this. I mean, they do have kind of arguments and reasons for why they believe it. Now, we can engage with them and doesn't mean anything goes and we just say, oh, that's fine, what goes for you is fine. But, you have to kind of engage with why people think these are reasonable grounds for belief and not just assume that they just do so dogmatically. And, and so rather than say, oh, it's just faith, the really interesting conversation is, well, how does faith fit into that wider project of belief formation? What does make you think it's justified and so forth? And again, people are, in that broad sense, rational. I mean, I think another book I wrote was called The Edge of Reason, and it was really about the nature of rationality. And I think that too often people do try to boil rationality down to some combination of logic and science. And that's actually simply not true. Logic and science are actually two of the clearest and most successful examples of how we can use our reason. But that's partly because they are concerned with things which are pretty nailed downable, if you like. Logic actually doesn't really tell us anything about the real world, but it tells us about the logical relations between concepts. And so, that's very successful because of a very, very defined domain. And natural science is a way of studying the natural world. And again, that's kind of quantifiable. But we reason about other things. We reason about ethics. We reason about the existence of God and so forth. We're not doing science. We're not doing logic, although we may bring in elements of those. What we're really doing, the clues in the word reason, we are reason giving. We're giving reasons. And we're giving reasons which we think can be discussed, can be analyzed, can be judged, and can be assessed by others in ways which are open and criticizable and so forth. And so that kind of reasoning is going on all the time with religious believers. Absolutely.
Helpful. Yeah, it's good. Julian, when I was in middle school, I read L'étranger, The Stranger by Albert Camus. And I was kind of shocked. The first lines of the book are the words of a young teenage boy who says, "Yesterday mother died, or was it today?" And that shocked me, obviously. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize Camus is logically consistent. If there is no God, if there is no creator, then life is ultimately meaningless. Death simply ends the absurdity that birth began. And therefore, if mother died yesterday or last week, or if mother dies next week or next month, ultimately it's insignificant. And that got me thinking. Then I listened to more of my atheist and agnostic friends communicate that life has meaning to them. And then I began to realize, wait a second, if you tell me that there is no supernatural, that all of reality is simply matter and energy, if you're telling me that we're simply bags of chemicals, and then you say, therefore, love one another, that's irrational. Now, if you say, my opinion is that it would be healthy to love one another, I understand that. But if you come off with a dogmatism, acting as if loving one another is objectively true, you're contradicting yourself. How would you respond to that type of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting, what is the foundation of ethics if you don't have a religious belief? Well, we should also just park the question here that what is the foundation of ethics if you do have a religious belief? Because you all know the old Euthyphro dilemma, which is, it can't simply be the case that something is good because God says it is, because that would make goodness arbitrary. Obviously, God says, if you believe in God, God says something is good because it is good. So in a sense, goodness has some existence for the religious believer, which is independent of God. But that's a separate point. But let's stick to the atheist side. If you're saying that it would be irrational to hold a naturalistic worldview and to believe that moral values exist, have some kind of objective, independent reality, you would be right. I think that's true. But there are plenty of people who say that's not a problem. I mean, in a sense, it's a problem. It seems to be a problem, particularly if you've grown up or you've been in a culture where it's always been taken for granted that somehow morality has some kind of objective existence. If you take someone like David Hume, I'm a big fan of David Hume, who is known as the great infidel, even though actually he is probably better characterized. Well, he characterized himself as an agnostic rather than an atheist, but the technical distinctions there. I mean, Hume, like people like Adam Smith, thought that the basis of morality was essentially a kind of compassion, a fellow feeling. It's that we recognize in others that it's kind of that suffering is awful. We recognize that thriving is good. And these aren't scientific facts. These aren't things you can establish. Well, that's the basis of morality. And what we find is that actually it's pretty good. It works well. If you look at cultures around the world that have religion or not, or believe in a deity or not. If you take a culture like China, for example, which, Confucianism is not a religion in our sense. Wherever you go in the world, people generally act well to each other, not universally, of course, without having to have some kind of objective moral code. And I'd even go further than that. If you think, I ask people to think, look at your experience, think about the people you know, think about the people you believe to be really good people. Are they acting well because they think, well, this is what is commanded of me, and therefore I'm going to follow it? I think that's really not what you see at all. What you see are people who are just genuinely, they're kind, they're compassionate, they have a feeling for their fellow human beings, and that's why they're good people. If they have a religious belief, maybe that will help or not help. But but the fundamental motivation is human sympathy, and I think that's enough. It's not if you get into demand that there must, in addition to that, be some kind of objective, like, rule of the universe. Is to ask for something which I think it can't be given, and I think is unnecessary as well.
Well, I think it's intellectually dishonest, though, to think with my intellect that life is ultimately meaningless and that morality is ultimately relative, but you should not say that. You should not treat other people of different ethnic heritages differently. You ought to do this. That is rather hypocritical, I'm convinced, intellectually.
Well,
if I say that I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, and then you go out and watch me womanize, I hope you would point your finger in my face and say, Cliff, you're a hypocrite. You say that you believe with the top of your head intellectually that Jesus is the truth, but the way you live your life contradicts what you say is true about reality.
Well, first of all, I'm slightly concerned that you've used the words irrational, intellectually dishonest, and hypocritical in what I believe was a civilized and respectful conversation. So I'm a little bit disappointed about that, I have to say. Now, let's go back to the substance of what you're talking about, though. We have to go back various stages, actually, because you said 2 or 3 things in quick succession, and I can't remember exactly what things were. Let's take the first one. Life is ultimately meaningless. You said to say that life is ultimately meaningless. Sure, but you've got to understand exactly what that means. What does ultimately meaningless mean? It means that there is no meaning outside of life. There's no sort of meaning given to life by either a creator or some extra human reality, superhuman reality, right? But of course, if you think about what the meaning of meaning, the fact that something is ultimately meaningless does not mean it is completely meaningless. A lot of the meaning that people find in their lives is contingent upon them being human beings, members of certain families, and so forth. So in a sense, I think it's looking for meaning in the wrong place if one's looking for ultimate meaning. In fact, I'm not quite sure what ultimate meaning would even be, to be honest. But the life is meaningful if we find reasons to live and we find value in life. You see, in a sense, the term meaning of life is one which I think is somewhat misleading. I think it's more useful to think about what is the value of life. And the value of life is found in many things in life, things that people recognize: love, creativity, art, experience, and so forth. These things have value. Now, there's no hypocrisy there, and there's no irrationality there, and there's no intellectual dishonesty there, because asserting those things have value is not in any way claiming that that value comes from an objective external source. So it's there's no inconsistency. The objection, if there is one, is that that's not enough for you, that you think that if that's the only source of value is from within human life itself, and that there's nothing from outside it, that you find that that's not enough. It's too insubstantial, it's too thin. And that's something a lot of religious people do believe. But, the fact of the matter is that plenty of people don't find that at all. They find that more than enough. So in a sense, we end up with just people stamping their foot one way or the other. There's no sort of like way to settle this in that objective way. You said a few things after. Your first thing was if life is ultimately meaningless, and I've tried to say why that's not a problem. You said a few other things after that, so I don't know if you want to come back to them.
Well, I'm convinced, Julian, that something is right or wrong, not because God arbitrarily decrees it. I'm convinced instead that there is a good God who has a good character. And because God's character is good, and because we're created in his image, therefore all of us, be we atheist, agnostic, theist, whatever, we all have this innate imprint on us called a human conscience that enables us to understand right and wrong, good and evil. That's why I use the words should and ought, that I'm convinced all of my atheist friends use, all of my agnostic friends use. So we have this innate moral indicator that indeed there is a good, objective good, and an objective evil. You use the issue of suffering. Good word. But if there is no God, Julian, what's wrong with suffering? Suffering just is. So let's not sort of arbitrarily call it good or evil. It just is. In other words, if there is no God, and if we reduce all of reality to matter and energy, then the simple conclusion is what is. Well,
certainly from a certain perspective, that's true. If you take the objective scientific perspective, that is true. But that's not the only perspective we have on life. We have the view of life from the inside, from a lived experience, and so forth. And I think I go back to the example of, let's look at the way people actually behave. If you see someone suffering, you do not need an intellectual argument to see that that is bad. You do not need people who have completely different beliefs about ultimate reality and the source of goodness, Christians, non-Christians, Buddhists, whatever it might be, they recognize that suffering as being a bad thing that we should try to eliminate. And it's not a logical argument. It's nothing to do with ultimate reality. It's experiential. It's about sympathy and so forth. There is a sense in which if you need it explained to you why suffering is bad, you don't really know what suffering is. Simple as that, So again, it's one of those things where I find these conversations can be a bit frustrating, because on the one side you have religious believers, and also some philosophers are called realists who insist that without some objective basis for ethics, it's all just groundless and all other opinion. On the other side, you have people who seem to, like myself, who find ways of having just simply no problem with that. It's that they think that you're asking for something unnecessary and so forth. And so I can't really see a way of ultimately eliminating that. But I think our experience, let's go back to our experience, does tell us that good people, good people are good people primarily because of their capacity to sympathize and to feel, to put themselves in the place of others, to respond with sympathy. Actually, it's interesting. I'm very interested in. I have a book coming out on the moral philosophy of Jesus, and if you look at a lot of the characters in that, it's amazing how often what moves people is sympathy, something like that. So when the father of the prodigal son, for example, he doesn't make a judgment that he ought to bring the son back. He sees his son and he is moved by sympathy. Jesus is often said to be moved by sympathy. This is a fundamental motivator even in the gospel. And it's not about sort of principle. I don't think Jesus ever, well, not ever, but it's not primarily a case of here's a moral rule and you must follow it, and that's it. It's all about compassion, understanding. The Good Samaritan, the Good Samaritan, the story of the Good Samaritan is it doesn't really matter what sect you belong to or what belief you have. Right. You recognize the suffering of a fellow human being and you respond to it. That's your neighbor, and that's Jesus saying that. I mean, I shouldn't get into a discussion of Jesus with you because I'm sure you've read the Bible much more than me. But it is.
Julian, I wonder. So perhaps there's a little bit of a middle ground when it comes to the meaning and the morality question. I think perhaps what you guys are saying. I think there can, me personally, there be meaning in life without there being a transcendent order, but perhaps no ultimate meaning in life. And that's why Camus, Nietzsche, and so many others did go after if there is no God, then there is no meaning, purpose, morality. Dostoevsky saying that if there is no God, you can do what you want. Now, oftentimes atheists get offended by something like that because they'll say, well, you're saying atheists are less moral than Christians. And me, in my personal experience, I know for a fact that that's not true. I mean, Christians are known to, one of the sad saying is shoot their own. Christians are known to be very tribalistic. Atheists, the knock on them oftentimes that I hear is atheists do perhaps good things out of selfish desires. So from an evolutionary perspective, helping someone could be for an atheist to better themselves. Oftentimes I'll hear that's the knock. For me, it gets back to, I think if you look at the history, and you would know this better than me in terms of the history of it, but the Greco-Roman Empire, and certainly Stoicism as well, there was always a type of logos, and I would call it lowercase l, which is simply rationality, the philosophy that would tie into the transcendent order. So there was something outside of the self, and you were to align yourself with that rationality, that divine principle, they would call it. But then all of a sudden, Jesus Christ was born. God punched a hole into the immanent world and was born here on earth. And then you get a capital L, logos, which is not just a divine principle that you're supposed to align yourself with, but instead at the very heart and center of the Greco-Roman Empire and beyond, obviously, you have a personal, loving God, which created every human being in his image. So we all have indelible worth and value. And then you have atheists like Luc Ferry and so many others who say, if you chart that history, you all of a sudden see this incredible transformation in terms of loving your neighbor, and that there's true reason and rationale behind really loving your neighbor. Does that Is that kind of what you've seen as well in the history of it?
Well, I mean, I think it obviously the way you've presented that story is from a very Christian perspective, because you talk about the coming of Christ into the world as this sort of event, which obviously is not the way it'd be understood unless you have that Christian faith. I think it's interesting. I think what you have is, if you look at the history of it, you have people like Plato, you have people like the Stoics. There's a long tradition of trying to see the basis of goodness and ultimate reality as being in something transcendental, some sort of way. And then you also have people like, particularly Aristotle, who is a more sort of worldly philosopher, who doesn't seem to have that idea of there being an independent order separate from us. And these have been two trends in philosophy. What Jesus changes, if you're a Christian, he changes everything. If you're not a Christian and you look at it in terms of the teachings and the ideas, I'm really bad at remembering names, but there's a very good book called I think it's called Jesus as Philosopher. I mean, virtually all the elements of Jesus's teachings are ideas that are around in the Greco-Roman world at the time. There's people say forgiveness is a distinctively new thing. It's not a distinctively new thing. People say loving thy neighbor. It's not a distinctively new thing. And some of these some of the phrases Jesus use in the Gospels are very strikingly similar to things you find in Greek and Roman philosophy. So obviously, as a Christian, one thinks there is something special. There's something changes when Jesus comes into the world. But since I'm not a Christian, I can't really see that, to be honest.
Yeah. And then back to the meaning part of it, I think in terms of the consequences potentially now from a worldview, whether it's atheist, whether it's Buddhist, whether it's Hindu, whether it's Christian, whatever it might be. Obviously, the Christian understanding is, I don't primarily align myself with just Christianity as a religion. I talk about it more so as a relationship with Jesus Christ, and what are the implications of that? What are the potential consequences of that? And so for me, as more so of a pastor than a psychologist or apologist, I personally, when I'm sitting at the bedside of somebody dying from cancer or from another disease, to be able to say that there is life after death, that gives a type of resource that, say, agnosticism or atheism, any type of secularism, probably couldn't give. Now, I know that there's many books out there, like Nothing to be Afraid of, written by an atheist, who says, let's get to the point of radically accepting our finitude. And then we can get to this place of actually enjoying life more. And I know you talk about this in your book, which is a fascinating idea. But I just wonder, I think there in the UK, just probably like here in the US, I know sociologists, just about everyone I've talked to or read, would say that now more so than ever in the West, we do not have a resource to confront suffering and even find meaning in suffering, because we don't so much have a transcendent moral order, like even Hindus and Buddhists. So maybe I would align even more so with them on this point, as opposed to all of my meaning is located here on this planet, on this earth. And that is confronted by suffering in a pretty painful kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so quite a lot that's sort of brought up on that. I think that it's one thing that I find a mistake. It's a mistake for atheists, I think, to deny the toughness of their beliefs. It is hard. It is tough. There is no ultimate redemption. There is no happy ending. There's no cosmic guarantor who's going to come in and sort of like take the life that has been awful and has redeemed it. Although having said that, I think that, again, different types of Christianity, but I would take that over the kind of God who's going to condemn a lot of people to eternal damnation, if that means suffering, right? So I think the universe would be a much better place without heaven or hell than it would be with heaven and hell. Would it be a better place if there were heaven and no hell? Possibly, but again, there are issues around that. Mm-hmm. So I think it is difficult. And so, for example, one of the things I will mention in the second edition of the atheism book is that there was a campaign in the UK which was supported by Richard Dawkins, where they put these posters on the side of buses, mm-hmm. and the slogan said, "There's probably no God. Stop worrying and enjoy your life," or something. The thing I like about the slogan was the probably. I thought that's good. It's sending this message that atheists are not dogmatic. They accept the fact it's only probably. But then the second part was just glib to me. So stop worrying and enjoy your life. Well, great if you can, but not everyone can, and not every life ends happily. I think that's so for the atheist there is a tragedy about a lot of life, but there is also for a lot of atheists enough about life to redeem it on its own terms. It is possible to have a good life. It is possible to face death and not be terrified, not feel that it wasn't worth it. There's some good examples of this in history. I mean, there are good examples every day, to be honest. If you speak to the secular humanist organizations in the US or the UK, there are people there who do, burial services, and things like this. And funerals are often, places where people are not left absolutely devastated. They don't go, oh my God, that's the end. And they celebrate the life. They think that's enough. And the person dying had the same wishes. And we also have plenty of evidence that plenty of people are perfectly capable of meeting their death in that way. One of the most famous, again, go back to David Hume. David Hume, extraordinary. There's some very wonderful records of his last days. And he didn't believe in any kind of life to come. He thought it was the end. And he was remarkably cheerful. He died actually a few days ago. The anniversary of his death was only a few days ago. He did cheerfully. Now, again, I have a terrible memory for names. A very famous Christian writer at the time. He wasn't primarily known as a Christian, by the way, but he was a Christian. Was so kind of grimly fascinated by the death of David Hume that he went all the way up to Edinburgh to kind of witness if it was really possible that someone who didn't believe in God could actually be facing their end with equanimity and calmness. And he was disturbed. He was actually disturbed because he met him, he saw he had no fear, he saw he had no worry, and this shook him. Because he was a religious believer who thought that in a way this shouldn't be possible, this can't be possible. He was shaken by it, and he even said that it even shook his own faith a little bit. So he was going there expecting to kind of see the belief of the atheist being shattered by the imminence of death, and it was actually he himself who was shaken. He didn't lose his faith; he kept his faith, but he found it a bit of a test. So so to sort of sum up all those things, yes, sometimes it is the case. Sometimes it is the case that there is suffering, death without redemption. And that is a tough bullet to bite if you are an atheist. But then a lot of the time, hopefully most of the time in normal circumstances, there is life is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful gift. And its transience, the fact that it doesn't last forever doesn't make it any less wonderful. Many wonderful things in life end. You don't think it was awful that you went and saw a play because it finished. You think that was wonderful. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of attitude is the attitude that the positive atheist has towards the world. But there are some nihilistic atheists who sort of like think that the world is terrible, the world is awful. Yeah. And that's the character being portrayed by Camus in The Outsider. I think the person who just deals with this with just complete nihilism. But that's not inevitable.
I promise you I'm not a stalker, but I went to your Instagram page and I saw the book list. I went to get your details so I could put it up on Twitter as well. I saw on your Instagram page, it was interesting, the books that you were reading. And one of them you had, what is it called? When Breath Becomes Air.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
The writer there, I think, is a neurosurgeon, I believe, died of cancer. Now, he became a Christian once he got the diagnosis. And he was a tremendously hardened, I think he was a pretty angry atheist even before then. But when he was confronted with death, and it had this whole idea of, when you're sitting around the table with every single family member of yours, and every one of them is going to most likely in some type of horrible, painful way going to leave this earth. And the most important thing on earth is that you want relationships, loving relationships, to last forever. And so I can see your perspective on that, but it's fascinating how that author, that neuroscientist, moved from basically saying, no, I want life to go on forever. When Steve Jobs was passing away from cancer as well, he said, I can't believe all my experience and all my relationships are going to disappear with the click of a mouse. And so I think there's some desire there, especially the things that perhaps are not as tangible, because when Breath Becomes Air, that author as well, he talked about human rights, sacrifice, forgiveness, love, all these things that are just again, not tangible, they're ephemeral, and yet they're so real to us, have to apply to some type of God, appeal in that kind of way. I don't know if you had something else.
Well, I mean, just to go back on, we find stories that go both ways. We find people who do become religious when they confront death. We see people who lose their faith actually when they confront suffering. A friend of mine, the father of his wife, when he was dying, he had been religious all his life, and he kind of lost his faith because he couldn't get it. He just didn't get how this good God would put him through it. So, the anecdotes, I think, sort of can be used on both sides. So I don't think they really prove anything. But in terms of the desire, there is something. I think there's something that's hard to grasp about things just finishing, even when one accepts that they do. That's true. There's a desire for things to go on, but whether there's a desire for things to go on forever, I think that depends a lot on how you think about things. And I think that, we're not very good at imagining these things. We're not very good at thinking about these things. And all I know is that there are plenty of people who, like myself, who when they have thought about these things long, hard, and whatever, can accept things that some people think, how could you ever accept that? That seems just too harsh. In terms of, whether or not there has to be some, you go back to say there being some transcendent basis, suffering, sacrifice, and so forth. The book of mine, which is coming out in the autumn, where I looked at the teachings of Jesus, the premise of the book is that there are a lot of people, and you probably might get sort of frustrated by them, who say, I don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, but I think he was a great moral teacher. And all the book's really asking is, let's say, if he wasn't the Son of God, was he a great moral teacher? So, you'd have to kind of discount a lot of the stuff in the Gospels, which is clearly only makes sense if he was a Son of God. And then you're just left with the teaching and the example. And I think the example is very interesting, actually. I think that Jesus often teaches by example. You'll probably agree with that. Mm-hmm. Now, for me, I have to say, I think his teaching is more powerful if the story ends with the crucifixion and the burial, without the postscript about the resurrection. The power of the teaching, that the most valuable thing you can have is to, no greater love hath man than to give up his life for his friend or his brother. I mean, that is a much more powerful teaching if you actually are giving up your life. It's a less powerful teaching if you get it back again at the end. So for me, these values around sacrifice and suffering and so forth, I think these are much, much more admirable values when we don't believe the person is going to be ultimately rewarded from them. They did it because they loved people so much that they're prepared to lose their life for it. And that is completely amazing if you don't believe you are going to be rewarded. You don't believe you're just going to come back to life.
But Julian, if the grave is the goal, why take yourself so seriously? If the grave is the goal, why do you use the word human value? Why do you use the word redemption? I mean, I think Friedrich Nietzsche was spot on when he pointed out that if there is no God, there is no ultimate value to life. There's no real purpose to life. And therefore power. Seize as much power as you can and move people around and exercise that power and elevate yourself. Christ comes along saying there is something bigger than yourself. You're to live for God and you're to live for others. And not only does he say that, but he points out that life is so precious that God created you to live for eternity. Because we've sinned and rebelled against God, we have a death sentence hanging over our heads because God is just. He's good. If you're a good person, you're going to be angry when you hear about a rape of a woman, when you hear about racism. If you're a good person, you begin to realize, I'm a liar. I have lied. I'm someone who's lusted. I've committed adultery in my head. I'm a predator. I have sought to use a woman as a sex object. I mean, if you're really good, you've got to think about these issues. You can't just blindly go off and say, well, it's just what is. And so when Jesus Christ points out that there is real purpose to life and that God created us for a reason, that squares with my experience of life. And it squares with the experience of my atheist friends. All of my atheist friends are wonderful people. But they are so good because they understand goodness is not arbitrary. It's not totally relative. It's all just not a crapshoot. So that is why I have a real problem intellectually with my atheist friends. Not morally. Morally, majority of my atheist friends are wonderful philanthropists. They are very kind people.
Right. Okay. So again, trying to sort of get back to what the key point there is, I think there's the problem I have is that there are distinctions made which are what you call false dichotomies. You ask me to make a false choice. So the choice is either morality is entirely objective. It's something that exists independently of the human world, whether we like it or not, and we're answerable to it in that fully objective way, or it's completely arbitrary. It has no basis whatsoever. It is pure preference. Now, there is a middle position between those two things. It's not arbitrary that rape is awful. It's not arbitrary to say rape is awful because it is something. It creates suffering. These are bad things, and you can understand what bad means and good means without having to appeal to a transcendental realm. So it's not arbitrary at all. I mean, so the word arbitrary, I think, isn't the right word. So again, it's going back to what we said earlier, really. The insistence that there has to be some fully objective underpinning of this is something that a lot of people feel strongly, and they're intellectually convinced by it, like yourself. They find it, they're not intellectually satisfied by anything else. But I do think part of the problem is the assumption that without that objective basis, it's all purely arbitrary. It is the case that without that basis, there is no purely logical argument against someone who decides that all they're going to live for is themselves, or all they're going to live for is their will to power, or so forth. You don't defeat that person by arguments. You defeat them by, well, if they are kind of psychopaths or sociopaths, you can't defeat them because they don't have that sort of sympathy. You defeat them by experience. So again, if you think of moral change, a lot of moral change, moral progress that we get is based not on people accepting new arguments, but on people developing a richer understanding, which is nothing to do with abstract moral philosophy or anything. I think actually abstract moral philosophy is very extremely unimportant for making people good people. So for instance, if you take a lot of the prejudices, I mentioned David Hume as being a great philosopher, but he was prejudiced against black people, as a lot of people were in his time. Aristotle was prejudiced against women and slaves. What is it that leads people to grant equal rights, to see these people as equal? It's usually personal experience, right? And actually very interesting this, because many years ago, I wrote a long article for the Financial Times magazine on atheism in America, which was fascinating. So this was a while ago. Things have changed quite quickly, I think, in the States over the last decade or so. I met a woman there who was, if I give her a full description, you can see she lived in a place called Point, Texas, a small town in Texas. Renee, and she's a wonderful woman, and she had a really tough time because she was a lesbian single mother, but she was also an atheist. And the point is, being an atheist was the biggest problem she had in that town. Why was that? Well, it's because actually people did know homosexuals, and they knew that they were nice people. They knew they weren't weird predators. They'd got to know them. They had lesbian, and they also knew single parents. So they had a personal experience of that. So they may have had some moral objection to that lifestyle. They may have had some objections, but they didn't have prejudice. They didn't have hatred, and they didn't sort of ostracize or penalize for it. Atheists, they didn't have a clue. They thought atheists were devil worshippers or something like that. They never had any experience of it. And as you say, as people get to know atheists, then they lose that prejudice. They become more compassionate and understanding. So I think it's just another example of how what makes people good, what makes people kind, isn't about ultimate principles or any principles at all, actually. It's about having that humane response to your fellow human being. And again, actually, I do think that, I'm not saying that Jesus would agree 100% with me on this, but I think Jesus did, by his example and his teaching, point out how that's a really important factor, at least for him. It certainly wasn't his view that you must follow the law because that's the law, full stop. You know, he was very much about promoting and developing compassion and sympathy.
And he pointed out that none of us follow the law. That's the problem. No atheist, no Christian follows the law. We all are sinners. We all have rebelled against God. And that's why he comes to bleed and die on a cross to offer us God's grace, God's forgiveness. Well, that's quite a mouthful, Jesus. Well, he backs up those claims by an historical resurrection 3 days after he dies, which gives his analysis of human problem, which gives his truth claims tremendous credibility, because he died and rose from the dead. And that's historical evidence supporting that.
Well, we'd have to have a very long discussion if we want to get into historical evidence for the resurrection. That's obviously, I don't accept there's a good historical evidence for the resurrection, and as a lot of people don't know, I think it'd be a whole separate discussion. I see we're 45 minutes in on that.
Well, you can't accept the historical resurrection because you don't accept the possibility of the supernatural. So obviously, if there's no supernatural, an historical resurrection could never occur. So you
got my reasoning the wrong way around. You got my reasoning the wrong way around. I haven't decided there's no supernatural and therefore there's no resurrection. Okay. It's not that I've come to my conclusion about whether there's a supernatural realm or thing on the basis of my experience and evidence of the world. So it's my judgment of the evidence of history and what I see around me, which leads me to my naturalistic worldview. I don't just pick the naturalistic worldview and then dismiss outright the supernatural, right? So you've got to get the order of these things kind of correct.
Sir, an atheist is someone who says there is no God. All of reality is material. There's no spiritual, there's no supernatural God. Yeah. Therefore, when you are confronted by a claim that a dead man rose from the dead, how can you claim to be seriously considering that the dead guy rose from the dead? It's impossible. Well, yeah.
Look, but the thing is, you don't just get to that point from nowhere. Right. You get to that point on the basis of reason and argument and so forth. And when you get to a point in your life where you've looked at every single claim that has been made for historical, for these things, and you decide it just doesn't happen. And it doesn't mean every time someone says, but you haven't looked into this. But we have looked into it. There's no historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. There's actually very little historical evidence that Jesus lived. There's very little contemporary evidence. There's actually no contemporary evidence that Jesus lived. It all comes afterwards. So, I don't think, I think it's a bit, I think that, you talked about honesty before.
Yes.
Well, listen, I don't know. You might honestly believe the historical evidence is there. That's fine. I think that doesn't really stand up. I think that if someone says that they believe in the resurrection of Jesus, not based on historical evidence, it's not like you can go and dig up archaeological remains or find DNA in the way normally. Sorry?
I've never done that for George Washington, dug up his bones, or King Edward or King John either.
Yeah, I know, but there are records which are very, very reliable, and then there aren't. I thought, tell me if I'm wrong, my experience has been that for most Christians, certainly of a certain stripe of Christian, what convinces them that Jesus arose from the dead is that they believe they have experienced him in their lives today. It's not actually about history. It's about they believe they have experienced the love of Christ personally. They have a relationship with Christ today. That's why they believe in Jesus. It's not based, they haven't done a scientific study and gone, he exists. It's based on that experience. So I'd just like to clarify that, because if that's the basis of it, I don't think it's sort of, they talk about the order of which beliefs came. I think without that personal experience of Christ, without believing you've experienced his existence, his grace in your own life, I don't think on the basis of pure archaeological and historical evidence alone you would believe that he existed. Would you?
Very, very, very well put. Anthropology shows us that around the world, every culture has some type of religion. We have an innate thirst for God. That's another piece of evidence that someone is knocking on the door of your heart, Julian. God really loves you. Jesus Christ loves you. And that's not just some white Western phenomena, some ethnocentric prejudice. That's around the world. People believe there is some type of supernatural God. Now, if a person says, I have experienced Jesus' love, but then you go back and read in the Gospels that Jesus says, hate people. If you go back in the Gospels and read how Jesus taught an incredibly high ethical standard, but then did not live up to that standard and instead went around womanizing, you'd be a fool to put your faith in Christ. He's a hypocrite. But if the evidence historical in nature is that not only did he teach an incredibly high ethical standard, as you, I appreciate, have seen, but he also displayed the moral power to live up to that ethical standard in a way that I have not, Julian. I am a dirty, rotten sinner. Now, of course, I love to rationalize the wrong that I do, and I'm brilliant when it comes to rationalizing my wrongdoing. I can explain to you and explain away every sin I've ever committed. There's always a reason. I can always blame somebody. But when I'm honest with myself and look at my heart and my motives and my ambitions, Jesus is right. I have a sin problem. And I don't think you are too much different from me. You do a lot of good at times. I do a lot of good at times, but I'm also a sinner. I think you are as well, if you go over your life with a fine-tooth comb. Now, Jesus addressed that issue and says, I died on a cross to forgive you. I rose from the dead. Come on, trust in me, and I will reconcile you to God. I'll redeem you, to use the word you so beautifully used.
Well, I mean, I think one of the powerful and I think the useful things about Jesus's teaching, and I think that my book concludes that there are things that are worth us bearing in mind in today, is that strong challenge. I think that perhaps we're not comfortable enough with, we're too comfortable in our moral standards. Now, I wouldn't use the language of sin because that is a very particular theological standard, but it is absolutely true. Human beings fall short. We're deeply imperfect. And I think the recognition of that is very, very important. I think also there's you could debate this point, but I think that, you know, it seems from the gospel that Jesus didn't think even he himself was perfect. When he's approached and said, "A good teacher, you know, what should I do?" He says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God." You know. Now, I mean, some people say he's saying, you know, no one's good but God. You call me good, therefore I'm God. I think the more straightforward reading, he's saying that no one's perfect. Jesus loses his temper. Jesus curses a fig tree for not giving figs when it's out of season, right? I mean, so I think Jesus himself displays imperfection. I think the power of the teaching is not that Jesus was perfect and that therefore, you know, that's great. It's that even Jesus himself acknowledged his imperfections and showed his imperfections, but he called us nonetheless to always be striving. Be thee perfect, he says, be thee perfect. Obviously we can't. So he's asking us to do the impossible. Now, that's paradoxical. You might say it's irrationally logical. I don't think it is, because I think the idea we should strive to be better than we can ever achieve is a good way to live. And actually, it's interesting that when you speak to, you know, athletes and sports people and musicians, they will say things like that themselves. I'm reaching for perfection. I know I can never get there, but that's what I'm reaching for. That's what's part of their motivation. I think that we should have that same, if we could be that serious about sport and music and art, we should be that serious about our goodness too. So I think that's a very powerful message.
Bertrand Russell used your cursing of the fig tree to say, look how Jesus lost his temper. You've got to be kidding me. Jesus used the cursing of the fig tree to make a point about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. And for Bertrand Russell to critique Jesus' cursing of the fig tree as a destruction of nature and a fit of temper is so intellectually dishonest, it's scary. How many trees had to be cut down for Bertrand Russell to write all the books that he wrote? The books were on paper. Come on, Bertrand Russell. Don't act like you're morally superior to Jesus because he cursed a fig tree to make a point. You've made a lot of points, Bertrand Russell, in the plethora of books that you've written. So there is such a dishonesty there that, come on, let's be honest with each other. And then to try and picture Jesus as saying, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect, as being unrealistic or into perfectionism? No. Read in context. Clearly, Christ is communicating. We were created by God for a purpose, to love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Yes, that is moral perfection. Yes, I fall short of that moral perfection. I have not always loved God. I've not always loved people the way God created me to. I have violated the purpose for which God created me. That's why I need his grace. That's why I need Christ's death on a cross, to pay the penalty I deserve before a just, holy God, not before a despot, not before a God who loses his temper. I have done real moral evil. I'm in desperate need of forgiveness. I might not like that fact. And a lot of my atheist friends have been very honest with me. And they've said, that's exactly why I'm an atheist. Because I do not want there to be an objective moral good, an objective moral evil that I violate. And the way I deal with my guilt is, and the way I justify doing whatever I want to do is, just wiping God out of the picture. I'm not saying every atheist does that, but many of my atheist friends who I've gotten close to have been humble enough and honest enough to acknowledge that. In other words, Julian, I think it's a very real possibility that a lot of atheists do not find God for the same reason that a criminal doesn't find the police. They're running away. And I understand that. I want to run away from God. Why?
Well,
I want to do my own thing. I want to do God's thing.
I'm a bit disappointed with this line of argument, because there are lines of arguments. Atheists use similar, what we call ad hominem arguments against religious believers. They say things like they're hiding from their own mortality. They're too weak to stand up to the reality of the world. And, I haven't really tried to bring those arguments in because I didn't want to, because I wanted to have a good open discussion with you. So, I'm a bit disappointed you're accusing me of like this running away from this. I don't think it's running away. I do think that
I did not say you, sir. I don't know.
Okay, right.
Okay. Harvard, Stanford, junior colleges, haven't gone to college, who've just shared that with me. I don't have the faintest idea what motivates you, Julian. So I'm sorry for miscommunicating.
Yeah.
I didn't mean you. I didn't say you.
I haven't heard.
On you.
I haven't heard. Thank you for that. But I haven't heard atheists say what you've said. Actually, I think so. It's interesting because that's not my experience at all. But in terms of I think it's one thing to acknowledge that we're imperfect and all this kind of thing. I guess, and again, I don't know whether you believe in eternal damnation and punishing sinners, but you have said a few times that you think we would deserve to be punished for our sin. And that is something I do have a problem with. If God is good and God creates people who are imperfect and can't live up to it and then punishes them for it, I find that deeply problematic. It's like if the idea I would be punished for not believing in God. A lot of people believe that's true, that God isn't, Jesus is knocking on the door. If I don't believe in Jesus as the Son of God, that I have made a willful choice to reject God and I must pay the price. Well, all I'm doing is, if I'm wrong, then I'm sorry. I have sincerely tried to make sense of this world. I've sincerely tried to understand religion and Christianity, and I have come to the conclusion that it is not the truth. Now, if God punishes me for that, it seems God is punishing me for doing my best. And that's to me is weird. That would make God a despot. So I hope, the Christian God, we say the Christian God. There are many Christian gods depending on different Christians. I would sincerely hope that no loving Christian who takes the gospel of love in Jesus would really believe that people are punished for coming to the wrong conclusion, doing the best they can to make sense of this world as it is. I would find that morally objectionable if that were the case.
And the good news is, Julian, the Bible says quite the opposite. The Bible says no one is going to be condemned because of ignorance, because they made a mistake. Nobody's going to be condemned because they're honest, so you have nothing to worry about. The only reason a person goes to hell is because they choose to live their life separate from God. In other words, hell is God's great complement to the reality of human freedom and the dignity of human choice. If I want to live my life separate from God, God's not going to haul me into heaven by the scruff of my neck. He's going to acknowledge, Cliff, you chose to live your life separate from me. You will spend eternity separate from me. That is hell. And Jesus clearly taught that. I will say to some people, depart from me. That's what hell will be. And that's a result of my decision. It's not a result of God's decision.
Yeah, but it's interesting you say it's a decision. It's not really like that. You don't decide. I didn't decide to not believe in God. I came to that conclusion. I didn't decide, because that's why I find this language very, very, very strange. You're talking as though I did make a decision one day. It's like, to make a decision would mean that I know God exists, but I choose not to follow him. Now that would be disobedience, right? That would be disobedience. But it's not that I know God exists and I choose not to follow him. It's that I don't believe he exists. And I can no more choose to believe than I could choose to believe other things I come to conclusions about. I look around the world, I use my reason and my experience to come to the best conclusions that I can. So again, I could be wrong, but if I'm wrong, I don't see how that could be characterized. You said the good news is no one is punished for their ignorance. Mm-hmm. Fine, but the implication seems to be that if actually I am not following God and not following Jesus, then it's not my ignorance, it's a choice. that's what I find problematic. I haven't chosen not to believe anything. I can't just go, I'm going to believe. It's my will. I can't believe in things. I have to.
I cannot believe in the pink elephant on my right hand. You're absolutely right. There's certain things we cannot believe in, okay? But I've got a conscience, and I've experienced guilt. And guilt, according to Jesus, is God's alarm system. Wake up, Cliff. You have done wrong. So now I've got to choose. What am I going to do with my guilt? Do I rationalize it away? Do I excuse it? Do I blame somebody else? Or do I turn to a God who says, yes, I give you that conscience, and now I've sent my son Christ to die on a cross to forgive you, to give you grace. That's what Christ offers.
But we go back to the beginning. I mean, at the beginning you said, I have a conscience. Now, you believe that your conscience come from God, etc., etc. I don't, and I don't believe it because I've decided not to. I believe there are explanations. There's a very good book by Patricia Churchland, neurophilosopher, called Conscience. It's about how conscience could have evolved in a purely natural world. It's not a complete account, doesn't explain everything, but it's very, very plausible. I find that plausible. So I don't believe God gave me a conscience. I believe conscience is something that we can see how it would have evolved. So again, that's not. It goes. It's not. These aren't choices I make. They're conclusions I come to, trying to think as honestly as I can. I gave Christianity a pretty good shot. I was raised a Roman Catholic. I even got confirmed. I drifted away from that. I went to the Methodist Church for a long time. I've given it I've really given it a good shot, and I in the end I couldn't believe it anymore because it didn't add up to me. It just, my experience and my reason led it. Now, I fully respect if you think I'm mistaken, I'm wrong, and all that kind of stuff. That's fine, and I could be wrong. But if I'm wrong in such a way that my mistake means that I am going to be punished in some way for that mistake, then I'm afraid that that God is not as good as some would believe.
Well, he's provided the ultimate solution for suffering, Julian. The cross of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, is the ultimate solution to something that you have been very eloquent about, the horrors of suffering. Julian, if there is no God, if Christ is not risen from the dead, there is no ultimate solution to the problem of suffering. We all will suffer. We all will die. So I would encourage you to go back, because the issues are so vitally important regarding Christ, his death, his resurrection, when it comes to dealing with I think what you have agreed with us is an incredibly important issue, the problem of suffering. Is there an ultimate solution or not? And if there's not, Julian, the only logical response is despair. For there is no hope for that suffering baby who dies. Dead and gone. Case closed.
There is a lot of despair in the world. There's a lot of unredeemed suffering. I agree. It's a tough message, but it doesn't mean that life is always, and even often or usually, meaningless or purposeless, and the life is always grim. There is a dark side. One of the things I say in my book very clearly is that that there's no point trying to be happy clappy about this.
Yes.
A lot of atheists don't like what they call happy clappy Christianity.
Right.
Happy clappy atheism is also not true. But it's neither is it the case that if you are an atheist, you must despair, you must be miserable, or else you're being dishonest in some way. It wouldn't follow. So we probably do need to conclude now. We're over the time. We're significantly over the time.
It's been an honor to talk with you, Julian. Julian, thank you so much. I think it's interesting, some of these points. Perhaps we have another discussion. You're a delight to have on. We'd love to have you on again. Some of these, gosh, we could go further. I love how honest you are, and I love how you take your atheism so seriously and look at the positives as well as the potential negatives and consequences. I hope we do the same. Thinking through, judgment is another tough one.
Yeah, judgment, that's true. Yes, the judgment of others is very, very big thing. Well, thank you for having me. No, thank you for having me. I think it's very good that you do this. We need to talk to people with very different beliefs from ourselves, try to understand them. It's really important. So thank you for having me on.
Definitely. We'll put your links on at the bottom, and have an awesome day. Thanks again for coming on.
Thanks a lot. Cheers then. Goodbye.